Welcome to Set Sail. Today is May 14th, and today our reading has been in Psalm 32, Psalm 51, Psalm 86, and Psalm 122. Today God gifted me with a gentle rain shower, and so I'm out there on the porch enjoying it. And I thought it was a beautiful picture of what's happening in David's Psalm. In these Psalms. If you were with us in the reading yesterday, in 2 Samuel, David's been confronted with his sin and his failures. It might be one of the lowest points in his life. And so in these 4 selected Psalms today, we get to see his response. And we get to see a lot of God's character explained. Psalm 32 is a maskil, which I am not a Bible scholar, but I'm told it's more a psalm of reflection and wisdom. It's very contemplative. Psalm 51 very much sounds like a prayer in action. And Psalm 86 and 122, I had a little harder time figuring out how they fit. But I'll get to that in a minute. I believe they talk more about the restoration and the work that God comes in to do after we confess, after we've messed up and we confess. So in Psalm 32, can't read. In verses 3 and 4, we get to see what happens when David is choosing to cover his tracks, to cover his sin, to try to hide what he's done. It doesn't leave him in a good place. He talks about his bones wasting away, he's groaning, he feels God's heavy hand on him, his strength is dried up. This doesn't sound like a very good place to stay. And so David has a choice. He can try to cover his sins or deny his sins, but this is probably the state it's going to leave him in. And when we mess up in our lives, this is what shame does to us. God convicts us, but God doesn't convict us to shame us. He convicts us to restore us. Because it's better for us, but He lets us choose. So we can choose to stay in this soul-weary, miserable place, or we can do what David does. And he chooses to confess. And when he confesses, there is so much joy and lightness of spirit. I don't know, a bit like the cleansing rain. He's washed clean. God's creating in him a clean heart, like it says in Psalm 51, and renewing a right spirit. He goes to God and he appeals to the characteristics of God that he calls out. He talks about your steadfast love, talking to God, your abundant mercy. He's so repentant because he's agreeing with how God sees his sin. He talks about his transgression, his iniquity. It's ever before him. What he's done is evil. And he admits that God is blameless in judgment because God is just and God is perfect and God has a holy standard. So the psalmist is aligning with God in this instead of making himself an enemy of God by hiding his sin and shame. I did think it was neat in chapter 51 when it talks about purge me with hyssop. This is the same hyssop that we saw in Leviticus in the purification of the temple. It's the same hyssop we read about in Exodus for applying the blood of the Passover lamb to the doorpost and the lintel. And this is the same hyssop that's pictured when Christ is on the cross when they give him the sour vinegar. All of these things are all pictures of God's grace. His plan hasn't changed throughout Scripture. It doesn't change because we mess up. His plan is to redeem and draw us close to him. Some other characteristics of God are described in depth in chapter 86, where God inclines his ear. God is not lofty and distant. He's present and he is listening and he hears. He talks in verses 13 about God's steadfast love and deliverance. Verse 15, God is merciful, gracious. slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And then in verse 16, the psalmist asks God to give your strength, give God's strength to the psalmist, not give David his own strength, but give David God's strength, which is really the only choice any of us have of drawing closer to God. Psalm 122 is actually one of the Psalms of Ascent, and at first I thought this seemed very disconnected. But in context of understanding David's sin and separation from God, and then the restoration and the blessing that he has through that forgiveness, through it being washed clean, it also restores in David the ability to worship communally. And so when he's talking about let us go to the house of the Lord, he's able to again join in worship where sin had separated him. He can now partake of that again. In verse 4 of chapter 122, he says to give thanks to the name of the Lord. We are all flawed. It is inevitable. We will all sin. And we're all corporately in need of that same level of forgiveness that David needed. What better accountability than to know we are nothing but forgiven sinners coming together to encourage and strengthen each other, and then to praise the God who washes all of that away, the only one who can bring us in right standing with him. I hope if this touched a chord with you today, that you would just pray and invite God into maybe those not so pleasant places that we all have. Ask him to show you if you have anything you need to confess before him, to bring yourself closer to him. It's a really good place to be.